Welcome to The Faithful Citizen. I'm Ellison Keller. What does a 1973 armed hostage crisis have in common with the soft-focus, curated aesthetic of modern Christian patriarchy? Today, we're tearing down the filters to confront the heavy, suffocating reality of extreme complementarianism. We'll explore the darkest corners of high-control marriages, the weaponization of theology, and the brilliant, agonizing survival tactics of women trapped inside them. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Let's get into it.
Yeah. Welcome to the space where conviction meets rhythm, where truth got a mic and the church gotta listen. This ain't Sunday talk, it's real life living. Faith in motion, the citizen's mission. We talk grace, we talk justice, we talk peace. Not the kind that conforms, but the kind that frees the world's loud with noise. We cut through division, this is the faithful citizen. Let's get to the wisdom.
In the late summer of 1973, a peculiar psychological phenomenon captured the world's attention. During a bank robbery in the Swedish capital of Stockholm, a multi-day siege unfolded that fundamentally altered our understanding of human survival. Hostages held in a vault began to exhibit deeply unsettling behavior toward the armed men holding them at gunpoint. Instead of resisting, plotting an escape, or showing terror toward their attackers, the captives formed a deep emotional bond with the very criminals who had stripped them of their freedom. This bizarre, counterintuitive alignment gave rise to the term Stockholm Syndrome, providing a clinical vocabulary for the psychological phenomenon in which a captive forms a protective, empathetic bond with their captor. The world watched, bewildered, as hostages defended their abusers, revealing how the human brain, when pushed to the very limits of terror, isolation, and helplessness, will radically rewrite its own reality and loyalties to survive. Fast forward to the present day. If you scroll through social media, you'll inevitably encounter the trad wife. She's a carefully curated apparition, an influencer emulating a 1950s white middle-class housewife, perpetually poised in heels and an apron. The algorithm feeds us endless loops of women baking sourdough from scratch and tending their homes with cheerful, uncomplaining submission. But beneath the soft focus filters, this phenomenon is often little more than a monetized exercise. It operates as an amped-up, kink-adjacent version of cottagecore, heavily layered with political and religious overtones. At its core, the trad wife movement is often steeped in white supremacist ideology and Christian nationalism, glorifying misogynistic submission. The Christian right has eagerly latched onto this trend, providing a veneer of biblical justification to argue for the urgent protection of their version of the household. They sell the image of white, cis, monogamous, reproducing couples as the singular, divinely mandated definition of a biblical marriage. However, there's a profoundly terrifying chasm between this monetized aesthetic and the lived reality of those trapped within its ideological borders. When we strip away the pastoral fantasy, we're left with the heavy, suffocating architecture of extreme complementarianism. High-control, patriarchal theology doesn't function as a recipe for domestic bliss. It functions as a systemic hostage situation. In these hyper-complementarian spaces, women are spiritually, economically, and relationally cornered. They're systematically taught their eternal standing, social survival, and physical safety depend entirely on their total, unquestioning submission to male authority. The pulpit serves as the heavy steel that makes up the vault door, and the weaponized theology of absolute male headship acts as the ropes that bind women and keep them in place. The resulting dynamic isn't a portrait of a flourishing, mutually submitted Christian marriage. It's a clinical hostage crisis, quietly unfolding in the living rooms of the faithful. If we're going to grasp how a woman survives such a suffocating environment, we need to move beyond traditional understandings of how the human nervous system reacts to danger. While most are familiar with the primal trauma responses of fight, flight, or freeze, there's a fourth, often tragically misunderstood survival strategy: the fawn response. Fawning is a complex, highly sophisticated mechanism of profound appeasement. When a victim subconsciously realizes that fighting the abuser is impossible and fleeing the environment is physically or socially lethal, her nervous system makes a desperate, calculated pivot. She attempts to neutralize the looming threat by abandoning her own identity, needs, and boundaries to relentlessly cater to the abuser. The victim forcibly shrinks herself, molding her personality, opinions, and very existence to anticipate and pacify the demands of the person in power. In the context of extreme patriarchy, a woman fawns by becoming the perfect, hyper-compliant, biblical wife. She suppresses her intellect, silences her intuition, and buries her emotional needs to keep the peace and de-escalate her husband's fragile and often volatile ego. The profound tragedy of the modern patriarchal movement is that it looks at a shattered, fawning nervous system and calls it a gentle and quiet spirit. It takes a woman who's been terrified into erasing her own footprint and baptizes her clinical symptom of abuse as the pinnacle of holiness. Before I go any further, and for those who may be reading my work for the first time, I want to be abundantly clear. The total subjugation demanded by extreme patriarchy isn't a fruit of the spirit, it's a clinical trauma response. By examining the clinical mechanics of Stockholm Syndrome, the lethal reality of economic abuse, and the destructive fabricated myth of biblical marriage, we'll reveal a starkly different reality. The women caught in these suffocating systems are far from weak, brainwashed, or childish. They're performing a desperate, daily, and highly intelligent strategy for their biological and psychological survival. To an outside observer, the behavior of a woman trapped in a high-control patriarchal marriage often seems bewildering. When faced with a domineering, coercive spouse, the logical expectation is that the victim will harbor intense anger, seek immediate escape, or at the very least recognize the inherent danger of her environment. Yet, within the suffocating confines of the hate grift, we frequently witness the opposite. Instead of plotting her exit, the victim meticulously defends her oppressor. She minimizes his cruelty, amplifies his virtues, and fiercely protects his reputation, all at the direct expense of her own physical and psychological well-being. This isn't the result of low intelligence, a lack of moral clarity, or an infantile mindset. It's the manifestation of a profound, traumatic bond. To better understand how this paradoxical empathy is forged, we'll need to examine the psychological soil in which extreme patriarchy takes root. The demand for female submission doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of a broader, measurable psychological profile. Empirical studies examining the intersection of theology and psychology show that individuals who score high on both explicit Calvinist theological beliefs and complementarian gender role beliefs also score significantly higher on expectations of interpersonal hierarchy. In other words, these individuals inherently expect dominance hierarchies to be present, to form, and to be enforced in their relationships. This isn't merely a passive biblical preference for traditional roles. It's a rigid psychological framework grounded in the belief that someone must always possess extra power and authority over others to ensure order. Why is there such an intense driving need for absolute control? It largely comes down to fear. These theological frameworks actively promote a psychological posture known as existential defensiveness. This is a coping mechanism in which individuals attempt to repress deep existential anxiety by clinging to a rigid belief in special protection and divine provision through God's absolute control. To quell his own internal terror and ambiguity in a chaotic world, the patriarchal man demands a localized world of black and white certainty. His home becomes the primary theater where this control must be continuously enacted. He requires an airtight hierarchy, with himself at the unquestioned and unchallenged apex, to stave off his own existential vulnerability. But what happens when reality fails to meet the demands of this rigid ideology? Sociologists have identified a troubling phenomenon known as gendered resource theory. This theory shows that the effect of a husband's resources on the likelihood of wife abuse is entirely contingent on his underlying gender ideology. When a husband holds egalitarian or transitional beliefs, a lack of relative resources doesn't significantly increase the likelihood of domestic abuse. However, for a husband with highly traditional gender ideologies, his masculinity is inextricably and singularly linked to his ability to be the primary breadwinner. If this traditional husband finds himself lacking the material resources to provide, or if his wife, if permitted to work, earns a significant share of the couple's income, his core masculine identity is profoundly threatened. Because his familial role no longer validates his gender ideology, he's significantly more likely to resort to physical violence against his wife to compensate for his lack of income. Violence, or the ambient threat of it, becomes a compensatory resource used to reassert his dominance and force compliance. The abuse isn't a momentary loss of control. It's a desperate, violent mechanism used to regain control and construct a fragile, easily threatened masculinity. Tragically, for women tethered to traditional men, becoming a primary breadwinner puts them at the greatest risk of physical abuse. This volatile intersection of existential terror, rigid hierarchy, and compensatory violence creates the perfect crucible for Stockholm Syndrome. But this crucible doesn't boil over all at once. This patriarchal ecosystem operates with such a precise, harrowing rhythm that we can map it directly onto the clinical cycle of violence. In a high-control home, the abuser ensures the victim's nervous system becomes entirely dependent on a four-stage loop. The first part of the loop is tension. The abuser creates tension, and the survivor's stress builds. Fueled by his existential defensiveness, the husband cultivates an ambient, suffocating atmosphere of dread, causing the wife to walk on eggshells, hyper-vigilant to his shifting moods, knowing that any minor infraction of his unspoken rules will trigger a crisis. The second part of the loop is explosion. The abuser lashes out to dominate the survivor. Whether through physical violence, economic sabotage, or spiritual condemnation, he strikes to reassert his absolute supremacy. Desperate to validate his power and soothe his existential dread, he threatens the survivor's physical, social, or spiritual survival, causing her nervous system to register a catastrophic threat. The third part of the loop is remorse. The abuser makes excuses, apologizes, or gaslights the survivor. In the patriarchal church, this phase is especially insidious because it's weaponized as spiritual gaslighting. He convinces the survivor that she provoked his wrath by failing to submit flawlessly, reframing his abuse as a righteous correction mandated by biblical headship. The fourth and final part of the loop is calm. Things appear to be peaceful, but it doesn't last long. The abuser temporarily stops the violence, offering a brief reprieve, a moment of calm, or a small, unearned kindness. When the cycle shifts into this final phase, when the abuser deliberates and chooses not to inflict the ultimate harm, the sudden removal of that threat floods the victim's body with a deep physiological relief. In the suffocating isolation of the patriarchal cage, where she's been systematically starved of genuine safety and autonomy, her traumatized brain misinterprets this biological relief, tragically transforming into profound gratitude and paradoxical empathy for her captor. She begins to defend him, magnifying his smallest mercies to help her mentally survive the reality of his tyranny. Her empathy isn't a symptom of gullibility. It's the brilliant, desperate calculus of a nervous system trying to survive a monster by aligning with him. She appeases, fawns, and bonds because her body knows that in a system built on total dominance, defying the man who holds the keys to her cage will only invite her destruction. When a person finds themselves in an environment of inescapable chronic threat, their body doesn't merely adopt new philosophies to cope. It fundamentally alters its physical presence. For women trapped in the suffocating architecture of extreme patriarchy, the fawn response is more than a behavioral choice. It becomes a somatic reality, a full-body adaptation to the cage's immediate demands. To survive a theological ecosystem that views female strength as an inherent rebellion, the victim's nervous system dictates relentless, calculated shrinking. When we observe the modern trad wife aesthetic on social media, the serene, hyper-feminine homemaker who cheerfully embraces domestic subjugation, we're often seeing a highly curated, monetized act. But when we look at the women living in these rigid, high-control marriages offline, we see this aesthetic's darker clinical counterpart, the physicality of appeasement. This shrinking often manifests in observable, deeply physical ways. Observers who interact with women in hyper-complementarian communities often note a distinct pattern of juvenile comportment. This physicality can sound like the subconscious softening and raising of the vocal register, an artificially sweet, breathless cadence often colloquially known as the fundamentalist baby voice. It looks like a deferential posture, avoiding direct, sustained eye contact, yielding space in a room, and cultivating an aura of mild, perpetual helplessness. The woman hesitates before speaking, qualifies her intelligence with self-deprecating disclaimers, and defaults to a posture of wide-eyed dependence, constantly signaling to the men in the room that she possesses neither the capacity nor the desire to challenge their authority. Tragically, when the secular world or progressive critics look at this behavior, they often resort to mockery. They infantilize these women, writing them off as brainwashed, immature, or intellectually deficient. They assume that a woman who speaks in a juvenile cadence and acts helplessly must genuinely possess the mind of a child. This is a devastating, insulting misdiagnosis that completely overlooks the clinical reality of her survival. We must fiercely and unapologetically reframe the childlike wife. The women exhibiting these juvenile traits aren't demonstrating a lack of intelligence, nor are they suffering from stunted emotional growth. They're demonstrating a highly sophisticated subconscious camouflage orchestrated by an incredibly intelligent nervous system. In the presence of a domineering, coercive abuser who uses existential defensiveness to maintain his power, female competence is exceptionally dangerous. The predatory ego of a patriarchal abuser requires a power vacuum to feel secure. If a wife demonstrates her sharp intellect, asserts her profound theological insight, or acts as a formidable equal peer, the abuser's fragile ego perceives it as a direct, insubordinate threat. That perceived threat is inevitably met with punishment, be it explosive rage, icy withdrawal, financial restriction, or spiritual condemnation. Therefore, the woman's nervous system executes a brilliant, agonizing de-escalation maneuver of making herself small. By adopting juvenile traits, she effectively disarms the abuser. She transforms herself from a perceived rival into a non-threatening dependent. A predator doesn't feel the need to violently crush something that's already cheerfully kneeling. Her fawning isn't a symptom of stupidity, it's her armor. It's a daily, exhausting tactical operation designed to soothe the volatile tyrant who shares her bed and grants her conditional access to their bank account. The husband doesn't merely demand this performance of submission. The theological institution itself rigorously enforces it. We must understand the currency of compliance within these communities. In conservative Protestant environments, women are systematically denied access to legitimate positions of ecclesiastical or institutional authority. Because they lack access to these key structural resources, adopting the schema of biblical literalism and ultra-conservative views becomes a defining means of demonstrating their religious commitment. If a woman can't prove her spiritual worth through teaching, executive leadership, or open theological debate, she must prove it by rigorously adhering to the very ideology that restricts her. She realizes that her social survival, community standing, and reputation as a good Christian depend entirely on how well she performs this ultra-conservative, submissive role. Female students and congregants often feel a heightened need to adhere to conservative teachings precisely because it's the only avenue available to them to validate their devotion. Her theological compliance becomes the currency she must pay to exist within the community. But the psychological cost of wearing this camouflage and paying this price is apocalyptic. Chronic fawning requires a woman to orchestrate her own psychological erasure. To stay safe and retain her standing in her church, she must continually lobotomize her instincts. She must swallow her righteous anger until it becomes a physical ache. She must pretend not to know what she profoundly understands. If she has a brilliant insight into a theological text or a household financial decision, she must carefully steer the conversation so the idea appears to come from her husband, allowing him to claim the credit while she bears the exhaustion of managing his emotional fragility. Over years and decades, this performance hollows a woman out. The tragedy of the fawn response is that the mask eventually fuses with the skin. The constant ambient demand to shrink her intellect, her theology, and her vibrant personality results in a devastating loss of self. She survives the war zone of her home and her church by erasing herself from them entirely. She becomes a ghost haunting her own life, trading her authenticity for a fragile, negotiated piece that can be shattered the moment she accidentally stands up straight. The institutional church looks at a shattered, hyper-vigilant nervous system, desperately trying to appease a tyrant, and calls it a gentle and quiet spirit. It takes a terrified woman, compels her to bury her formidable intellect, and places her on a pedestal as the ultimate model of biblical womanhood. This isn't the fruit of the Spirit. It's the architecture of appeasement, built to protect men's power at the direct, devastating expense of the women they were commanded to love. When observing a woman drowning in a high-control, coercive marriage, the secular world and the moderate church often arrive at the same deeply dismissive question. If it's really that bad, why doesn't she just leave? It's a weaponized question rooted in the profound privilege of the untraumatized, operating on the naive assumption that the door is unlocked, the path is clear, and the victim simply lacks the willpower to turn the doorknob. But the door to the cage is never unlocked. It's heavily fortified, reinforced not only by psychological chains and traumatic bonding, but also by calculated material deprivation and civic erasure. To ask why a woman doesn't simply walk away from a patriarchal hate grift is to fundamentally misunderstand the lethal, multi-tiered calculus of escape. Leaving isn't a casual relocation. It's a desperate prison break that risks everything she's ever known. If a woman manages to push past the psychological terror of her environment, she immediately collides with the catastrophic material reality of her cage. The modern extreme patriarchy movement vehemently champions the traditional single-income household, aggressively demanding that women abandon career aspirations and financial independence to focus entirely on domestic submission. We must stop pretending this is merely a nostalgic preference for a 1950s lifestyle. It's a calculated, systemic mechanism of financial abuse. Empirical studies of domestic violence show that abusers systematically use economic exploitation, employment sabotage, and tight control over resources to ensure their victims remain entirely dependent. By controlling how resources are distributed, hiding joint finances, giving victims a strict allowance, and actively preventing them from acquiring or maintaining a job, the abuser guarantees she can't afford her own freedom. When a woman is barred from the workforce, she loses the ability to build a resume, establish credit, or build a professional safety net. For this woman, the reality of leaving is brutally mathematical. Escaping her abuser means plunging herself and often her children into immediate, catastrophic poverty. She doesn't stay because she enjoys the subjugation. She stays because the system was expertly engineered to ensure she can't afford to feed herself and her children if she leaves. This economic hostage-taking extends far beyond mere cash flow. It infiltrates her legal and documented existence. To further trap their spouses and maintain absolute dominance, abusers frequently omit the victim's name from key household documents, joint bank accounts, or property leases. When a battered woman finally attempts to escape and seeks legal or immigration relief, she collides with an invisible wall of bureaucracy. For example, immigrant victims who self-petition under the Violence Against Women Act are legally required to prove they entered into a bona fide marriage with their abuser. In these situations, the victim faces nearly insurmountable evidentiary hurdles. Abusers maliciously destroy marital documents, wedding photographs, and personal letters, eliminating the primary evidence she needs to secure her legal status. Attempting to obtain these joint documents or correct the record safely can provoke a violent reaction from the abuser, putting the victim in mortal danger. The systemic exclusion from household documentation is a deliberate, highly effective control tactic. Keep the victim off the financial records, and the state will deny her status, leaving her perpetually trapped. To keep a woman fully compliant, the patriarchal system must not only strip her of her financial and legal independence, but also sever her from her divine calling. Complementarian theology mandates the total erasure of a woman's vocation, demanding that she bury the fierce, kingdom-shaking gifts the Holy Spirit has given her. The Southern Baptist Convention offers a harrowing historical blueprint for this vocational erasure. In the late 1980s and 1990s, the SBC orchestrated a systematic theological campaign to articulate a rigid, biblical theology of women's submission to men's authority, and to remove women from pastoral roles. By 2000, Baptist seminaries were aggressively deterring women from pursuing Master of Divinity degrees and pushing them entirely out of preaching classes. Because only men were deemed biblically fit to serve as pastors, highly qualified women were systematically barred from the pulpit. Women like Martha Bumpus, a missionary actively pursuing a calling to full-time ministry, were forced to leave seminary and resign from their organizational posts. Complementarianism consistently claims to be about biblical faithfulness. Still, in reality, it costs women their biblical callings and shuts them out of the very spaces where their easer strength is desperately needed. The terrifying reality of this ideology is that the lockdown doesn't stop at the church's threshold. Christian patriarchy doesn't remain confined to Christian spaces. The ultimate endgame of extreme complementarianism is the total civic erasure of women, mainstreaming a theology that seeks to undo the foundational rights of women's citizenship. Prominent conservative voices like Doug Wilson are now using their growing public platforms to argue for revoking women's political agency. Controversial advocates like Abby Johnson, Dale Partridge, and Joel Webbin have recently expressed their support for a head of household voting system. This proposed system would effectively undo political suffrage for married women, stripping them of their individual right to vote. This is justified by the complementarian rationale that, in a godly household, the husband would get the final say. This is the true devastating cost of the complementarian grift. It can strip a woman of her fundamental agency as a citizen of her own country. The system demands that she suppress her intellect, earning potential, spiritual vocation, and political voice, until she is entirely absorbed into the identity of the man beside her. When we calculate the cost of leaving, we must recognize that a woman within this system is fighting a sizable religious and political machine designed to ensure she has no money, no legal documentation, no ecclesiastical support, and ultimately, no vote. The true miracle of the wilderness isn't only that these women are surviving the psychological trauma, it's that they're finding the strength to walk out the door and dismantle an empire built to erase them. To maintain its absolute grip on the home and the sanctuary, the patriarchal machine relies heavily on a foundational, unquestioned myth, the idea of a singular, pristine, biblical marriage. The religious right has convinced millions that the scriptures offer a clear, unbending, and perfectly patriarchal blueprint for holy matrimony. They wield this concept as a weapon, arguing for the urgent need to emulate and protect hyper-cisgendered, heteronormative households. But when we strip away modern political rhetoric and read the text, the empire's defining myth collapses. The biblical marriage championed by the complementarian establishment is a heavily sanitized modern invention used to enforce compliance and justify control, fueled primarily by what people mistakenly believe the Bible says. If the nuclear, patriarchal family is the absolute centerpiece of the Christian life, one would expect the New Testament to be overflowing with explicit instructions on how to cultivate it. Yet the texts present a startlingly different picture. The two main voices of the New Testament, Jesus and the Apostle Paul, have been retroactively associated with modern family values. Still, there's little textual support for such an endeavor in their teachings or lifestyles. In fact, we don't find a marriage-positive Jesus in the New Testament canon. He actively disrupts the biological family unit in favor of a spiritual one, and he lived as a single man in a culture where marriage was deeply expected. Similarly, the Apostle Paul, driven by a fervent apocalyptic mindset, appears utterly uninterested in long-term relationships. He explicitly favors singleness or widowhood, urging believers to remain unmarried if possible. Ultimately, there's a relative dearth of information about marriage in the New Testament. The empire has taken a topic that Jesus and Paul largely bypassed and transformed it into the absolute litmus test of Christian orthodoxy. When the Bible uses marriage as a metaphor, the patriarchal establishment cherry-picks the romantic elements while ignoring the horrifying. We see this most clearly in the prophets' writings, which frequently rely on negative images and intimate violence to depict the relationship between God, Israel, and Judah. Instead of explaining away the violent imagery in these relationships and marriage metaphors, we must confront it directly. When examining the book of Hosea, we must wrestle with the high probability that Hosea was an abusive man and use that lens to interpret the text's depiction of intimate violence. By reading the text honestly, we find that these writings by the prophets can offer a blueprint for abusive relationships. The institutional church rarely preaches on this terrifying reality because acknowledging that the text contains blueprints for domestic abuse threatens the pristine, infallible picture of patriarchal headship. They would rather spiritualize the violence than admit that the text reflects the brutal, ancient reality of male dominance. To secure the cage, the complementarian system must also weaponize reproduction. The modern trad wife movement and extreme patriarchal theology insist on a clear biblical mandate for women to fulfill their roles as heteronormative baby makers. This theology systematically reduces women, stripping them of their multifaceted identities and defining them almost exclusively by their reproductive capabilities. But Scripture depicts a wide, messy diversity of birthing, parenting, and family structures that shatter the tidy nuclear mold. We must actively disrupt the devastating narrative that women function primarily through their uteruses. The reality is that everyone is affected by scriptures that portray women that way, and we must shift the theological focus. When a conversation about reproduction hinges on a woman's anatomy and doesn't also treat that woman's life situation as equally or more important, we're seeing one of the toxic misinterpretations of biblical depictions in action. Where did this fierce, unyielding demand to protect the white, middle-class, traditional family at all costs come from? It's not an ancient theological mandate, it's a more recent political development. To fully grasp this modern obsession with the patriarchal home, we must now turn our attention to the Jim Crow South. In the 1950s, segregationist Christianity provided a robust theological foundation for resisting racial integration. But as explicit segregationist theology became socially unpalatable, the demand for a rigid social hierarchy didn't disappear. It merely changed its vocabulary. By the 1970s, segregationist Christianity had evolved and persisted in new forms that would become mainstays of Southern white evangelicalism: colorblind individualism and a heightened focus on the family. This new rhetoric of individual colorblindness allowed conservative white Christians to argue against programs and policies that promoted racial inclusiveness. Crucially, this biblically inspired focus on their families trafficked in the new language of colorblind individualism, even as that language was itself tied to the segregationist theology of the old. The religious right realized they could no longer openly enforce a strict, segregated hierarchy in the public square, so they retreated to the sanctuary and the living room. They doubled down on the traditional family, treating the home as the final, unassailable fortress where white male supremacy could be absolute, unquestioned, and legally protected. The extreme patriarchy we see today isn't defending Eden's original design. It's defending the ideological descendants of an empire that evolved its method of control. As we come to the end of this season of deconstructing patriarchy, we need to acknowledge the women reading this from inside the cage. These women are currently modulating their voice, policing their intellect, and desperately trying to anticipate the shifting moods of the men who claim to speak for God. Their plight isn't one to be minimized or ignored. The religious institution may have told them that their relentless appeasement is a spiritual virtue. Outside critics may have told them that their inability to leave is a sign of weakness. Both are profoundly wrong. These women aren't weak. They're running a daily masterclass in survival. Their nervous system is keeping them alive in an active war zone, and their fawning is the brilliant, agonizing camouflage that prevents their own destruction. We must never let anyone shame them for the armor they have to wear while they're under fire. But the heaviest burden of that armor is the lie they've been told about the Creator. The men who hold the keys to their cage baptize the abuser and condemn the hostage. They weaponize the sacred text in an attempt to convince them that God is the architect of their prison, and their subjugation is the divine order of the universe. These men openly lie about Jesus Christ. The true God of the universe doesn't have a fragile ego that requires women's erasure to feel sovereign. Jesus Christ isn't a warden. He didn't go to the cross to make the patriarchal cage slightly more comfortable. He went to the cross to tear the doors off their hinges. Where is God in all of this? He isn't standing in the pulpit with the men who use his name to crush women. He's weeping with the oppressed, waiting for the moment they realize the door has already been unlocked. There will come a day when the oppression must stop. When oppressed women finally break through the walls of the hyper-complementarian fortress and step into the vast, uncurated expanse of the wilderness, their traumatized nervous system will scream that they're in danger. The empire has spent years telling them that the wilderness is a barren, godless wasteland where rebellious women go to suffer. We must also vehemently reject this lie. The wilderness isn't an exile, it's a sanctuary. It's the only place wide enough, quiet enough, and safe enough for all to finally drop their masks. Healing begins the moment the body recognizes the threat is truly gone. Out here, there's no fragile patriarchal ego demanding constant subjugation. With the threat removed, the shrinking can finally end. Daughters of God, you don't have to be small anymore. You can shed the juvenile cadence and speak with the full, resonant authority of your own voices. You can reclaim your fierce, piercing intellect without ever having to apologize for it. You weren't created to be a perpetual hostage, endlessly fawning for the right to exist in your own home. You were designed as the Ezer Kenegdo, a formidable, rescuing warrior ally. The camouflage kept you alive, and we honor it for that. But the war is over. It's time to take it off. Stand at your full height. The wilderness is waiting, and the world is desperate for the full force of who you are. Thank you for walking through the wilderness with me today. I know we covered a great deal of difficult ground. Confronting the clinical realities of spiritual trauma and naming the architecture of high control systems is agonizing work, but it's absolutely necessary if we're to dismantle the cages that have held so many captive. We have a profound responsibility to build a different kind of sanctuary together, a space where we can stand in our full strength, reclaim our true voices, and hold the door open for our brothers and sisters still searching for a way out. If this episode resonated with you, or if you know a woman who's currently suffocating under the weight of this theology and desperately needs reassurance that she isn't crazy, please share this audio with her. Hit the like button, subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, and leave a review. It's one of the most effective ways to help others find their way out of the fortress. The work doesn't stop here. Head over to our Substack to read the full written essay for today's episode, explore the clinical and theological citations we referenced, and join the conversation in the comments. We're actively building a community in the wilderness, and your true voice is vital to it. Take a deep breath of fresh air, guard your joy fiercely, and keep your faith resilient. I'm Ellison Keller, and this has been The Faithful Citizen.